Hi everyone, it's Mr. Nobody bringing you another episode of Making Nobody Happy. Now, I don't know if you've noticed by looking at me, but I am not the youngest man anymore. I am not the beautiful golden boy that I used to be. And my wife even teased me the other day for having made Golden Boy the name of my Wi-Fi network when I was younger, which it isn't anymore. Because the golden are swiftly fading to gray. But we were talking about the sort of perspective you get by getting older, or what you might call generational perspective. Now, this was also on my mind because I recently watched a series of interviews with people who had lived through the 60s. And the interviews were done in the 90s. And it was reflecting on who those people were and what they believed and what they did and how things actually turned out and how those people had changed 30 years later. And suffice to say, things turned out very differently than they expected. My wife was making a joke about watching something. She said she was watching something, and it was old. It was from the 60s or 70s, and there was someone wearing a T-shirt saying, "Don't trust anyone over 30." And my wife would just remarked, "None of those people are now under 30. They're all the old people now who are not being trusted." So clearly there was a problem there with the categorical imperative, whether something can truly be made universal. And I'm sure that now those people are over 30, they do not appreciate as much the t-shirts that they themselves are wearing at the time. So, anyway, talking about those people as I saw in these interviews, very interesting interviews. Now, those people who were being interviewed, talking about themselves in the 60s, they thought that everything that they didn't like was the fault of their parents' generation, and that they would do things radically better and be different and be radically better and different because they had that secret knowledge and perspective and wisdom and creativity that no generation had ever had before, certainly not their parents' generation. They thought they were what the world had been waiting for, everything had been leading up to, and now they were going to recreate the entire world. Now, as I said, 30 years later, very different perspective. I heard Mark Hamill talk about this, saying that he said, when we were kids, we thought our parents were responsible for everything that was wrong with the world, and we were going to make marijuana legal and fix every problem in the world once we were the ones who were in charge. And then here he is, he's an old guy now, and he's like, well, only one of those came true. And it seems to have had somewhat a very mild consolation prize for them. Now, I think the lesson that you can take from a look back like that is that everyone always thinks they're in the right in every generation by default. And every succeeding generation lives with the consequences of having been handed the world that the generation before them created. And often it's really not clear what the consequences of their own unique contributions and decisions will be, because the world turned out very differently than those kids from the 60s imagined it would be. And a part of why it's so hard to predict what your contribution to the world will actually be like, that's partly because those people, young people, the people of the now who are making those choices and changes and predictions, are taking so much for granted about their world that was really contingent on the people who came before them. So young people think that they know what the world is, and they think they know what they want it to be, and also that they're able to make it be what they want it to be. But it's not actually clear that they really understand either what the world is or what they want it to be, because they don't actually understand their parents or themselves enough to separate the world, in some sense, from what was contingent and variable in the behavior of each of their generations. And it's very hard to judge whether you're making things better or worse, because how we judge those outcomes is so dependent on our particular aims and values, and those aren't necessarily stable. They will vary a lot from generation to generation, and also because it's so dependent on how we see ourselves in relation to our parents and their generation, and vice versa. Now, I doubt that many of those people, and as I said, these interviews were done in like the 90s, 30 years later. Now we're another 30 years beyond that. Now, I doubt many of those people could have foreseen where we would be today. And people today have even less idea of where we will be tomorrow. We live inside tacit assumptions about the world that we have inherited, and tacit assumptions about the world that we think will pass on. And we're all a bit, well, let me explain what I mean by that. We think of the world that we're born into as this is just how the world has always been. This is what it is about. And it's always been that way. But actually, it's like, no, the world that you live in is very much the world defined by the actions of your parents. It was contingent. It reflects them and the way they did things, and you can't take those things for granted. They could disappear and be gone or be completely changed, because the world to come will kind of be defined by you, but like I said, you don't really know who you are or how much of the world is changeable, and you can't really separate the underlying structure of the world from the particular ways that your parents' generation responded to it, and those actually are different things. If you can grasp some of what I'm trying to say. Often we're all a little embarrassed as adults by the things that we said and that we did and that we thought when we were young. Time puts us all in our places eventually, and it's only in our middle or our old age that we finally start looking back and trying to actually understand the generations before us. I think when you're younger, we just take for granted that we understand them, or we don't really understand them. We think that's just the world. But it's actually, no, there is the world, but there's also the previous generation, and you really haven't tried to understand them. But as we get older, we start to see ourselves in the context of this long process of history, and ourselves as just the next step in it rather than the whole culmination, and not even the final step, as we start to see emerging ahead of us the next step after us, and then we start to see particularly who we were. And then all of a sudden we can look back and see particularly who our parents were, and we can see particularly who they were. And that really starts to expand our perspective on the world and on ourselves, and take a little bit of the silliness and solipsism and assumptions out of us. And that, I think part of that is that being put in your place by history happening to you is part of the wisdom of age. It's not necessarily that you are so great or you've learned so much, and I know it's always frustrating to every single succeeding younger generation, but there is something that happens as history isn't just something that's led to you, but it's something that starts to lead beyond you. It gives you a different look at it, and as you start to get put in your place by it, it makes you reconsider how you look at yourself, and as I said, how you look at others. You actually start looking back and trying to understand the generations before you so that you can understand the world that they gave to you and how they gave it to you, and how we can come to better understand ourselves and the role we're playing in handing things on to the next generation. It's amazing as people get older, they get more and more interested in looking back, even when they're not that old, just middle-aged. But over time, suddenly the things of the past become much more real to you, much more tangible. You really see the contributions, and all of a sudden, the things your great-grandmother did, rather than being some forgettable thing that finally led to me in my moment in the sun, suddenly you're like, those were the really important things. I'm interested in how they handled this whole burden, and how am I going to handle it, looking at their example. As a youth, we think we already know everything about all those subjects, and we're really about everything, and we're always willing to talk about them at length. But in our older years, with the benefit of perspective, we sometimes learn to start closing our mouths and finally start listening and thinking. And that's a valuable process. It's something that has been opening up for me. I'm someone who is not terribly interested. I didn't ask a lot of questions when I was young, like I said, because I assumed I knew everything, and I assumed that everything had just always been the way it was. How it became the way it was, the things my parents or my aunts or uncles or anyone had gone through before me, weren't that real to me and didn't matter that much to me compared to my moment and the things that were happening to me right now. But the older I get, the more real they seem to me, and the more I can identify with them and just see, oh, I see now how you were a young guy just like me, navigating this just like me, and now I'm more interested in what you did and how you did it, and now I'm seeing us all in relationship to each other more, and I can separate more the choices you made, the particular things you did, the sacrifices you made, the strengths you had, and then my own strengths and weaknesses as well. So, generational perspective. You can get it when you're younger. You know, we read the books and stories of the past, and that does a lot. It opens up the world for us, not just in width, but in depth. Especially these days with the way that media works, it's created much more of a, as much as we want to talk about great diversity, we're becoming much more of a monoculture, even on a world scale, more of a monoculture, less different from each other. But going back in time really opens up these different situations and different circumstances, and makes our world richer. But the truth is, now that I'm older, I feel like I get a totally new appreciation of those same things, a totally new understanding. They mean far more to me, and they seem more real to me. They seem closer. Even as I approach the point where I am more likely to become a part of history myself. And maybe that's just how life works. You know, we go through these cycles. But maybe there are things we can do to navigate them better or worse. That's all for today. See you next time.